Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Long Branch Free Public Library and to our Career Workshop Development webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Mariela Osario, and I'm the Career and Small Business Specialist at the library. We are excited to have Taryn Abrahams, who will be presenting Overcoming Internal Barriers to Strive Towards Success. But before we begin, I just want to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. And I also want to let you know that this is a very interactive presentation. So if you have any questions or any comments, feel free to include them in the chat, in the Q&A, or you can also raise your hand and Taryn will be happy to address your questions or comments as she goes along. Now, I'm going to share my screen and I would love to introduce to you Taryn Abrahams. Taryn is a corporate behavioral and human interaction expert, and she helps companies implement behavioral best practices to improve workplace interpersonal relations and holistically strengthen corporate culture. Leveraging her experience as a psychotherapist, Taryn's innovative suite of workshops are designed to enhance and nurture employee loyalty and ambassadorship. A clinical background and behavioral mindset differentiate Taryn from other human resource providers. Taking her work beyond a check-the-box compliance and HR focus, Taryn's interactive workshops, consulting services, and ongoing support can help your company create long-term sustainable change. And this translates directly to increased productivity, revenue growth, and solid marketplace reputation. Taryn's passion and energy to create safe, productive, and collaborative workplaces have helped countless employees, executives, and other professionals. Taryn, thank you so much for joining us and welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Mariela, for this wonderful opportunity. I am excited to be here and I'm excited to share what I hope to be helpful, impactful information that's going to create a positive shift. And so with that said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let's see. Always got to hope and cross our fingers that technology works, right?
Yes.
So, all right. So as Mariela mentioned, we are here to talk about overcoming internal barriers to strive towards success. And before I kind of dive into that, I wanted to talk a little bit more about my background. Mariela, you did a wonderful job of introducing me and highlighting the work that I do, but my background plays very nicely in this conversations today. I actually come with a different background than HR. I'm actually a psychotherapist by training. And so I have years of experience both in the clinical space as well as the business environment, helping to overcome internal barriers to drive towards success. Oftentimes, we can be our worst enemy, right? When it comes to dealing with change, pivoting, if you will. That is a word that we've heard a lot of during this pandemic, especially. And so oftentimes, it's not always the external stress that causes us angst. It's how we process the stress, how we internalize the stress. And so with that said, what I have prepared to kind of cover today is we're going to talk about why do we resist change in the first place? Why is change so uncomfortable for us? And I say us because I'm included. Change is not easy. We're going to talk about why that is. We're going to talk about ways to become unstuck. If you feel that you've been in a space where you feel you need to make a change, but perhaps there's some fears or resistance in order to make those changes. We're going to talk about some best practices in terms of how we can move forward and become a little bit less unstuck, right? And that's going to lead to a conversation about self-leadership. You know, we hear a lot about leadership in companies, but we don't always talk about the leadership within ourselves, how we can self-lead ourselves through challenging times and through times that bring change. And so with that said, I'm going to dive in. As Mariela said, I want this to be interactional. I want this to be interactive. Even though this is a webinar, I want everybody to feel comfortable interacting with me. If you have questions, I ask that you ask them during the presentation. Please do not decide to leave them at the end, because sometimes we run out of time, and I want to make sure that I get to all of your questions. And if you would like to ask me a private question, you don't want to put it in the chat for everyone to see, you can actually engage me privately. And Mariella will be able to manage all that different communication. So please engage with me. So with that said, let's dive in. This year has absolutely challenged all of us, including myself, both emotionally, financially, and even psychologically. And many of us have found that there's been just tremendous change, which has caused a lot of angst, whether it's social issues in the community, whether it's the pandemic or political issues. It goes without saying, it's been a very challenging time for many of us, right? And whether we are here to learn how to work remotely more effectively, or whether you've been forced to take on new roles or responsibilities in your family, or whether you've now become the caretaker of someone new in your life as a result of this pandemic, or perhaps you're looking for new work, the reality is we've all been faced with change, right? And either way, we've all been thrusted into a world of change, right? That seems to be the one constant lately, has been change. And everyone has something we need to change, right? Life is about change. And unfortunately, that is just, again, that constant that we were always faced with. And so there are a lot of uncontrollables around us right now. We certainly don't want to ignore that. There's a lot that is going on around us that we feel maybe not in control of. But where we're going to focus on today is what we can control, which is what comes into our head, how we think, and how we feel. There is a lot of studies and research to suggest that our mindset impacts how we feel, and how we feel impacts the decisions that we make and the behaviors that we display. So for today, we're going to be talking about the change, or the things that we can focus on, the things that we can control, which is ourselves. And also too, change is very hard for all of us. Most of us struggle with change, right? And oftentimes, but despite our best efforts, we tend to resist that change. So we're going to be talking about that, just that today. So let's talk about that word, the C word. The change is what I mean by the C word, right? So change is not actually an event, right? It's very easy to look at it as an event. This happened, now I have to change. But change is really more a psychological experience, which is why it's very challenging. In your head is a single action that happens to us, right? You get promoted, you lose a team member, you may move to a different neighborhood, you may have a child, you may go through a divorce. Or something that may need to happen. I need to lose weight. I need to start a diet. I need to implement a new process. A simple case of action. Action equals reaction, right? And then the change is done. Not so easy. Motivation oftentimes becomes an issue. People get angst. They start to feel that uneasy feeling. We naturally start to resist change. We may argue with others or with ourselves. We sometimes are oftentimes driven by our fears, fear of success, fear of failure, fear of the unknown. Quite frankly, it's hard, right? It's hard to deal with change. Our challenge with change, though, is not because we're obstinate or misguided or that it's difficult. It's because as humans, we need to adapt to the change, even the changes that we make within ourselves. And so I want to start this with a poll question. And the first poll question that I have, is how are you with change, right? And so I'm going to stop my screen and release the first poll. So as you participate in this first poll, ask yourself, how are you with change? Are you great with change? Do you welcome it and embrace it? Do you find yourself, I'm okay with change, but I'd rather things stay status quo, rather things stay the same? Perhaps you don't consider yourself to be very good with change. In fact, you may avoid changes at all costs. You may really dislike change. It makes you very uncomfortable. Or perhaps you're not sure, and that's okay too. So I'll give you a chance to respond to this poll.
Actually, Taryn, while we're waiting for the poll, we do
Yes,
have.
I see.
Yeah.
Yes, I do see that. So the question is being asked, what if we know that the change is not the right change, and yet we need to submit to the change? Ooh, that's a really good question. We know it's not the right change. So that's the gut in you, right? That's that gut visceral feeling that we have, and the gut is usually correct. So I challenge you to kind of ask yourself, why is this change needed, even though you feel that it's not the right change? And with that said, and we're going to be talking about this, do you not want to submit to the change because of fear, or because of you don't want it to change? What's the driving feeling, right? And so part of understanding this is we want to lead, and we want to make decisions that are sound decisions based on our gut, not based on fear, right? So that's just some questions. Unfortunately, I've answered your question with some more questions, but those are some things to think about. So let me end this poll and share the results. So Mariella, if you can just confirm, do you see the results?
Yes, okay. I do.
Great. So it looks like 50% of us are okay with change, but would rather things stay the same, which again, extremely normal. Some of us have said that we're great with change, which is fantastic. That is a wonderful skill to have. Takes practice to do that, but majority of us do resist change. So kudos to you all. And then some of us are not sure, which I'm glad to see that you've attended this webinar, because part of learning to understand ourselves is to, kind of take notice of how we deal with change. And perhaps this seminar will give you some opportunities to learn a little bit more about yourself as we go along. So thank you for participating in that chat. And I hope that as we go along, for those of us that are not great with change, you will take some gems from this in order to help you become better with change. So let's talk about why we resist change. As I mentioned, resistance is a psychological reaction to change, right? It's a self-protective mechanism. Change sometimes can feel dangerous. It could be uncharted waters, right? Sometimes status quo, even though it's boring and safe, it's familiar, right? And so despite highly motivated people with the best intentions, oftentimes we fight that change on a very psychological level. And we may not even be aware of it. It can be very much a subconscious thing. So to kind of open our eyes a little bit more in terms of who we are as individuals and how we deal with change, these are some of the sort of symptoms of someone, if you will, that may be struggling with change, right? We may procrastinate. We might put off our goals. We might feel like we're wasting our time, or we might fill our day up with things that are wasting our time, right? We're not really focused on the things that are really important to us. Making excuses, avoidance, right? Perfectionism, overthinking. Well, if I do this, then this is going to happen. And if this happens, then I'm going to be doing this. And then we end up putting ourselves, I call it the emotional pretzel, right? And then we're incapacitated. We can't do anything further because we have filled ourselves up with all the negative what ifs. Self-sabotage, low motivation and mood. So these are some of the examples that might insinuate that we are, somewhat stuck or afraid of change. At some point, we've all experienced this. I have included. I have felt it actually hundreds of times, if not thousands of times, right? Recognizing many of these behaviors within myself. So if the resistance to change is a common experience, why does it happen? Why does it feel so uncomfortable, right? Let's explore a little bit of the neuroscience behind that. The psychology behind resistance. When we experience something new, different, or unusual, the prefrontal cortex, which is this part of the brain, lights up, okay? This is the part of the brain that processes ideas, perceptions, logistics, and is extremely energy sensitive, okay? It can only process a certain amount of information and data at any given time, and it tends to fatigue very quickly. So when we encounter change, regardless of whether the change is good or bad, our brain needs to start to work harder. The extra effort that it takes to work harder is required by our prefrontal cortex to navigate change, and can also stimulate a psychological and physical discomfort. So there's science behind this. This discomfort can then activate the part of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for fight or flight or freeze, which is our response to stress, danger, and the unknown, right? Which is a lot of times what's behind change, which is unknown, right? We don't always know what's coming. When activated, this part of the brain can stimulate feelings of fear and anger and cause us to act emotionally and impulsively. It can also provoke psychological stress, such as denial, confusion, depression, and even crisis. All of this now explains why we naturally resist change. Not only does change require the frontal cortex part of the brain to work harder, it also causes psychological and emotional discomfort courtesy of the amygdala. It's no surprise that our body's natural response to resist change and return to safety of the status quo. So our brain is wired to bring it back to safety, to bring it back to status quo. The challenge, though, is life is full of change. That is the one constant. Each time we encounter resistance, we actually now have an opportunity to learn from it. Rather than being frustrated by our resisting ways or judgment about our abilities, we can use the change process as a learning experience. Resistance to change is normal. Anticipate it. Some of the most successful people in business and in world will tell you that they were afraid. They ignored that voice. They ignored it, right? It's not that they didn't feel it. They just chose to not let it dictate their decisions, okay? And so because resistance to change is normal, we are all likely to experience this from time to time. And during the early years of psychology, interestingly enough, resistance to change was simply analyzed as a motivational problem. Therefore, it was thought that to eliminate this resistance, we needed to motivate ourselves. Well, guess what, folks? It has nothing to do with motivation. We now know that when someone resists change, there are several areas that are in play: personality traits, life stories, or current situations. From this perspective, resistance to personal change becomes an amazing opportunity to look within ourselves and learn something about ourselves. In fact, when we can feel motivated to change, but something keeps us from it, like fear, motivation is not enough to overcome that resistance. That's why change is always an opportunity to discover ourselves. Try not to fight the resistance. Instead, accept it will happen. Recognize that resistance and understanding why it happens, you can start to focus on the energy that's needed to make a positive change into a long-term goal, right? So how do we do this, right? I'm sure a lot of us are thinking, okay, that sounds great, but how do we do this? And it starts within ourselves, right? It starts with that voice within our heads. We all talk to ourselves all day long. We are constantly having conversations and commentary with ourselves in reaction to others, in reaction to the world. When we watch news, we end up having conversations with ourselves about it. Some of us are aware of it, and some of us may be just realizing this right now. The inner voice in our brain can be very distracting and even difficult to ignore sometimes. The image of a tiny angel on one shoulder and a little demon on the other, whispering into your ear, may bring back the innocence of childhood when those voices often dictated our behaviors and actions. As adults, we still have that inner monologue, right? And that monologue we hold within our brains is also called verbal thinking or self-talk. I call it self-talk, right? That self-talk that I have with myself. Even though it's internal, this dialogue is still part of how we communicate and collaborate with others. And neuroscience now says that inner speech likely has an important part to play in how adults self-regulate their behavior and cognition. It can be very difficult to quiet that inner monologue, right? Especially when we're in times of uncertainty or chaos, which goes without saying, we're very much in that right now with this pandemic. But an unhealthy brain will not perform optimally, especially when faced with such challenging conditions like the pandemic. To find your inner voice, we need to first focus on what's going on in our minds and start to take actions to improve our mental health. We cannot make the right decisions for ourselves when there is an inner self promoting doubt and fear of failure, right? So our goal is to learn to recognize, and this kind of answers that private question, right? That is to recognize when fear and doubt are drowning out your true inner voice that is struggling to be heard, right? And so really listening to when you listen to your inner voice and your body is filled with heck yes, whereas the voice of fear and doubts fill our body with yuck and no, I don't want to do that. You're listening to your inner voice when you feel empowered, authentic, and peaceful. You will notice that good people and positive experiences get drawn to you with ease when you think positive. On the flip side, when you think negative or half glass full, you may notice that negative things happen more often. There is an energy force that gets created when you create positive thoughts. By listening to your inner voice, right? Not the fears, but the inner voice, you become the creator of your life rather than a bystander, right? So listening to your inner voice is like training a new muscle. It won't happen overnight, but if you make consistent effort to hone in on it, it becomes stronger and you'll be able to fine tune it to the right frequency, which really is about practicing mindfulness, right? So when we think to ourselves, I should be married by now, I should be making this much money by now, I should be this far along in my career by now, really challenge those types of thinking, right? Because those are the kinds of things that can whittle away at how we feel about ourselves. And we're going to be talking about the questions that we should be asking ourselves. But one of the things that we really need to focus on is that when we find ourselves feeling fearful or crummy or down or anxious or scared, it doesn't just come out of thin air. Thoughts become feelings and feelings create our behaviors, right? So really where we have the most power and control is figuring out how we think. What are the thoughts that we fill our heads up with every day? Right? I have certain clients that will tell me, I don't understand. By the end of the day, I have an awful headache. I feel crummy. My stomach hurts. I don't understand why. And then when we start to peel the layers back, we start to realize you've been very negative towards yourself. You've been that little, devil on your shoulder. You shouldn't be doing this. And why did you say that? And you doubting yourself, right? And so those become feelings and feelings become behaviors. So Mariella, do you have a question?
Yes, I do actually. So very interesting because I want to share quickly a personal experience. When I was younger, I was very naturally proactive. I considered change more, I looked at it more as an adventure. It got to the point where when my children were little, we had to move out of state because I was going through an ugly divorce and the kids were in danger. So I didn't even think twice. I packed up the kids. I'll never forget, it was a school night. I packed up the kids in the middle of the night and we just, drove past the state line, and that was it, right? Little did I know, now my youngest is now 26 years old, and he has difficulty dealing with with change or dealing with abrupt, circumstances.
Sure.
He suffers a lot from stress and anxiety. I'm a big believer of meditation, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that.
Yes.
My question to you is, are there other techniques other than meditation? Because I keep telling my son, well, you need to meditate, just even sitting down in a quiet space and just taking deep breaths. He doesn't believe it. It's like, no, it doesn't work for me. It's like, and I'm thinking, what other techniques are there that could possibly help him deal with his stress and anxiety?
Well, thank you so much for being so honest, Mariella. And the things that you're sharing, I have to think that are resonating with others on this call, because, a lot of us have experienced fears, anxieties. And what I would say is, well, the first part is, change, how we perceive change can impact us more than the actual change. If we look at change as going to be negative, then yes, that's going to evoke feelings of fear and anxiety and perhaps even depression. I meditate, right? But meditation, they call it a practice because you have to practice at it. It's very difficult to do at the beginning, especially if we're feeling anxiety, right? It's hard to quiet the mind. So I would encourage two things. One, sometimes meditation doesn't work for people. Sometimes people have a hard time shutting off their minds. Go online and find a mantra. A mantra is a saying that resonates with you. So for example, I am strong and I will get through this. That's a mantra. I just made one up just now, right? And there's science that suggests that when you repeat that mantra over and over again, and I mean like 50 to 60 times a day in a row, you start to rewire your mind and use those mantras also as a form of strength. If you find yourself challenged in some way, go back to the mantra and repeat it over and over and over again. It's very similar benefits to meditation. The other thing is when we're stressed, we don't breathe right. In fact, studies show that when we are stressed, we don't fill up our entire lungs. We shallow breathe. And shallow breathe can lead to things like anxiety and then ultimately a panic attack. Panic attacks don't just come out of thin air. It comes from a series of things that have happened that lead up to that. So if we can't meditate and mantra doesn't resonate with you, find time to stop everything and take some deep breaths. And I know that sounds very simple and basic and almost silly, but if we're not breathing right, we're not getting enough oxygen in our heads, in our brains, in our bodies. And if we don't have enough oxygen, we can't problem solve. We can't pivot. We can't think outside the box. So maybe developing some sort of ritual where you, a couple of times a day, take a pause and just breathe. Close your eyes if you need to, right? And close your laptop. And these things you can do anywhere besides driving. I wouldn't suggest closing your eyes and driving, but you really can do this anywhere. You can do this sitting on a train, on a bus, on the way to a meeting if you're not driving. And if you are driving, you can still practice those breathing exercises. Just don't close your eyes. But those are some of the things that I have found help me. I think that I think what we're trying to kind of hone in on here is the definition of insanity is what? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And quite simply, if any of us on this call want to feel different, we need to do something different. And it doesn't mean doing it once. It means making a decision, which goes to self-leadership, we're going to get to in a moment, about holding yourself accountable. I now have a reminder in my phone every morning to spend 10 minutes to meditate. I do not do any work until I do that. Just like I hold myself accountable to my meetings and my business commitments. That is something I have committed to myself. So it's deciding to do it, but it's also holding ourselves accountable. So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely, Taryn. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So we just got another question. How do you refocus positively if you've had some missteps and that are creating doubt? I'm so glad, and I'm going to table that for the next couple of slides because I have a feeling as I continue on this, I'm going to end up answering your question, but really great question. So as I mentioned, this self-talk, right? This inner commentary that we have in our minds. Take a moment right now and ask yourself, how have you been thinking today? Have you been critical? Has it been kind and helpful? Do you tend to think of things in glass half empty? Do you tend to be a pessimist, an optimist, right? Our thoughts are the source of our emotions and mood, right? That's where our moods come from, our thoughts. The conversations you have with yourself can be either destructive or beneficial. They influence how we feel about ourselves and how we respond to life events. Self-talk is something we all do naturally, right? Especially when we're awake. People are becoming more self-aware of their self-talk, and we're finding that once we can zero in on how we think and speak to ourselves, it becomes a very powerful tool in increasing our self-confidence and curbing negative emotions. People who can master positive self-talk are thought to be more confident, motivated, and productive. Although positive self-talk comes naturally to some, most people need to learn how to do this. With practice, it can become even more natural, and that you'll find as you practice, negative thoughts no longer have space in your mind, right? When we find ourselves thinking, again, should I be married, or I should be doing this, a way to carry that through is, okay, maybe I think I should be married, but ending it with, but I'm a good person, and I know this is my journey, and I know that eventually I will find someone, or maybe not, but I'm whole now, right? So you can have those thoughts, but you want to end them with something on a positive note, right? So I love this slide. I don't know how many of us have heard this saying, the most important conversations you will ever have is with yourself. And that's truly, honestly, the truth. That really is the truth, right? And so I'm going to ask then my second poll. How does your self-talk sound? What does it sound like, right? Do you tend to be mostly an optimistic glass half full person? Do you tend to struggle a little bit with that? Do you mostly find yourself being negative? So I'm going to release the poll. And let's see what we come up with. And if you're not sure, that's okay too. A lot of us are, in fact, studies show that up to 95% of what we think throughout the day is beyond our conscious awareness. So don't feel upset or embarrassed or ashamed if you're not sure. Give it another couple seconds. Okay. So it looks like most of us are positive self-talkers. All right, that sounds really great, but it takes some work, which is, again, a very natural response. This takes work. I think that the natural response is if we don't work at it, we tend to be somewhat negative. And especially with everything that's been going on around us, it's very easy to kind of become a little bit negative or cynical. So let's talk about the science behind this. Why does this matter, right? Barbara Fredrickson, a positive psychology researcher at University of North Carolina, discovered a couple things in her study. She realized that negative thoughts program our brains to do specific negative specific actions, negative emotions, and narrows our minds. And positive thoughts leads to deeper thinking, introspection, and innovation, right? So let me give you an example. Let's say that you're walking through the forest and suddenly a tiger steps in front of you, right? When this happens, the brain, the part of the brain, right, that is the amygdala that's responsible for fight or flight kicks in, and your brain registers a negative emotion, probably fear, right? Pretty scary. You're standing in front of a lion. But researchers have long known that negative emotions programs your brain to do specific actions. When that tiger crossed your path, for example, you probably were thinking to run. The rest of the world stops to matter, and you focus entirely, right, just on that tiger, the fear that it creates, and how to get away from it. At that same moment, though, you might have not noticed that there's maybe a limb that you can climb up on, a tree, or maybe you can pick up something on the ground, or a stick that might be able to defend you from this animal, right? But your brain ignores all those solutions because you are paralyzed by fear. This is a useful instinct if you're trying to save a life or a limb. But in modern society, thankfully, we don't have to worry about being pummeled by a lion. The problem is that our brain is still programmed to respond to negative emotions in that way, by shutting out the outside world and limiting the options we see around you. So when you experience positive emotions like joy, contentment, and love, you will see more possibilities in your life. These findings were among the first that suggested that positive emotions broaden your sense of possibility and open your minds to new options, right? So there's really a science behind this. And there's actually a word to describe what we're talking about. It's called the Art of Cognitive Reframing, right? Reframing. Wayne Dyer said it best. When you change the way you look at things, the things that you look at start to change, right? So reframing is a way to change the way you are looking at something, right? It can actually change your physical response to stress, because the body's stress response is triggered by perceived stress, not the actual event. I want to repeat that. Our stress response is triggered by our perceived stress, how we internalize it, rather than what the actual stressor is, right? So reframing is a way that we can alter our perceptions of stressors and thus relieve significant amounts of stress and create more positive life, because actually making any changes in our circumstances. So it allows us to be able to problem solve. It allows us to see things from a different light. And when we shift our perspective, our feelings change, right? It can actually turn a stressful event from trauma to something we bravely overcame, right? And so how does this work? The first step is becoming self-aware. Learn about your thinking patterns, right? The first step is educating yourself about how you internalize stress. Turn on the news, watch a little of news, not too much, but a little bit of news. And focus on what you end up telling yourself when you walk away from that. What are some of the things, how do you internalize that information, right? Do you tend to create distortions, right? It goes without saying, there's a lot of distortions out there around COVID, around getting vaccinated, right? We take a number and we make it bigger than it is, right? So a lot of it has to do with educating ourselves on our thinking patterns, right? And this will lay the groundwork for really understanding how to create positive change. Then you want to notice your thoughts, right? Catch yourself if you're slipping into overly negative or stress-inducing patterns of thinking. Being aware of them is an important part of challenging and ultimately changing our thought process. One thing you can do is just become more mindful of your thoughts and become an observer, right? When you catch negative thinking styles, just note them at first. You don't have to do anything about it at this point. Just notate them. Perhaps start writing in a journal. Perhaps, start writing it down in your phone. Take notice of the patterns in which you start thinking, right? And then the next step is to challenge your thoughts. As you notice your negative thoughts, an effective part of reframing involves examining the truth and accuracy, or lack thereof, of these thoughts. Are the things that you're telling yourself even true? Okay. Are there other ways that you can interpret that same information? Which ways of seeing those things serves you better, right? Instead of seeing things the way you always have, challenge the negative thoughts and see if you can adopt thoughts that fit your situation, but reflect a more positive outlook, right? And then the next step is to replace those thoughts with more positive feelings. And that is simply, creating that reframe, right? So perfect example is I'm going to get this COVID-19 virus and I think I'm going to die, right? A reframe would be, I'm going to take precautions. I'm going to do what I can to minimize my risk. And if I get COVID, I will do everything possible to fight it, right? That is only the control that we have, right? And so that is a perfect example of how we can replace those thoughts. And one way to really take notice of our thoughts, I don't have one with me right now, but if for those of us on the call that have long hair or even short hair, you could put a rubber band around your wrist. And every time you notice you have a negative thought, I want you to snap it. And that will gain awareness because, again, as I mentioned before, most of what we think throughout the day is beyond our awareness. And so that rubber band will give us, don't snap it too hard. We certainly don't want us hurting ourselves, but enough to make an impact and to waken ourselves up, right? And you will start to really take notice in terms of how often this happens. And you will start to notice that there's a connection between the things that you feed yourself, not the stressor, but how you process the stressor impacts how we feel about the stressor. So I see we have another question. Oh, this was from before. So I hope I've answered your question. How do you refocus positively if you've had missteps that are creating doubt? I challenge even the word misstep. People like to use mistake or misstep. I call those opportunities of learning. We don't grow when we play in the safe zone. We don't grow when we keep ourselves in status quo. We only grow when we push ourselves out of our comfort zone. And that's really important to remind ourselves. Expect that we're going to be uncomfortable, but we don't have to let it win, right? And I am here to tell you, and I've seen this time and time again in my own personal life, in my professional life, and those that I coach and work with, you very rarely regret stepping out of your comfort zone. Oftentimes you end up having regrets that you allowed fear to win, right? So, pushing ourselves, there's so much good that comes out of that. So I challenge you, when you label something a misstep, maybe it's pushing you in a different direction. That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Not necessarily a bad thing. So let's talk about self-leadership, right? Your leadership, your understanding of who you are, what you want, and what you are being called to do creates a firm foundation you need to take action, make decisions with confidence, and even especially during periods of great uncertainty. Self-leadership is about holding yourself accountable, whether it's something like, I'm going to think more positive, or I'm not going to allow myself to distort the information that I hear to feed that negative narrative. I'm going to hold myself accountable. I'm going to make sure that the information that I feed myself is accurate and true, right? It's about choosing to fight back those negative thoughts that impact our decisions. It's about stepping out of our comfort zone, and it's only when we step out that we grow and learn, right? It's about acting with integrity, especially when no one is looking. And it's about not letting fear win. I have a colleague that always tells me, this is his mantra: do it afraid. Do it afraid. It's okay, right? We have two choices. We can bounce back into our comfort zone, or we can push through the fear barrier, right? And everything we want in life is on the other side of that barrier. That's where all the good stuff is. That's where the growth comes from. That's where the empowerment comes from, right? So oftentimes people ask me, okay, Taryn, how do I get unstuck, right? That's the big question. How do I get unstuck? We've all been there, right? I've been there myself. That feeling that your life isn't going anywhere, or maybe you should be in a different place, or that no matter how hard you try, you always seem to find yourself in that same place. Feeling stuck is actually not a bad thing, because it's akin to a signal that you're being called towards a higher stage of your personal evolution. It's a learning opportunity. The main reason we tend to feel stuck is we sense a dormant potential trap within ourselves. Again, we should be doing something more. We maybe need that nudge, a reminder that we should be doing more or doing something different. We can't just simply settle for our current circumstances, but it's a positive thing. Understand first that there's no point resisting the feelings or expecting that it will go away. It's much better to embrace it as a signal pointing you towards the next phase of your evolution, right? So feeling stuck is essentially an issue of perspective. It's all in how you look at it. So let's utilize that reframe with that feeling of unstuck, right? The whole reason you're feeling stuck is that you're asking yourself the wrong questions. Anytime we feel stuck, we're essentially asking ourselves, why don't I have this job or position? Why don't I have as much money as I should? Why don't I know what to do next? You're subconsciously asking yourself why your reality hasn't matched your expectations yet in this current place. Well, logically, you're going to feel pretty crummy if you ask that question. So, and it's a game you're never going to win, right? So let's create a reframe. Let's create a different way of asking the same question, right? You'll never feel stuck again if you ask it this way. What is the one thing that I can contribute right now? That's it. Every time you feel stuck, ask yourself this. What is something you can create, give, produce, fix, offer, build that has value to someone right now? It could be anything, an article, a painting, a fundraiser, cleaning your desk, cleaning out a cluttered closet, right? It could be any of those things. What is something you can contribute now, right? What is something you can contribute now is the question, right? The only reason you felt stuck all this time is you haven't been focusing on the one and only thing that moves you. And what does move us, right? Contribution and value creation. Ironically, that's the one thing that gets us unstuck in due time. You know, there's something I've heard that really resonated with me, and I'd like to share this with everyone. Depression comes from worrying about the past, thinking about the past, replaying the past. Anxiety is about worrying about the future, the what ifs, the unknowns. Alleviating all of that angst is about being present in the now. What can you do right now? Period. Right? And so I ask you to comment in the chat. What is something you can contribute right now? So, and it doesn't have to be big. It can be something very simple, like I'm going to organize my closet, or I'm going to clean out my cluttered wallet, or I'm going to get rid of the clutter in the back of my trunk, whatever it is. But what is something you can contribute right now? If you want to feel different, if you want to feel better, you need to do something different, quite simply. And the smallest changes make the largest impact. We don't have to do big things to feel different, right? So I ask us as we kind of enter into the last, piece of this, how can you envision the future? What small change can you make starting today to create a small shift in your thinking, right? And when you ask yourself that question, say it in a way where not I'm going to do this, but I am blank and I will do this. So I am resilient and I am going to push through my fears, right? You want to focus on what you are right now, because everything you have now is what's going to help you get to where you need to be, right? So it's lifting you up, right? So comment in the chat. I'd love to hear from you. What is one small change you can make starting today to create that small shift? And I'm going to unshare. And if there's any questions or comments, I would certainly love to hear from you.
Well, thank you so much, Taryn. I really do appreciate it. I do have another quick question for you.
Yes.
Remember how earlier I mentioned that when I was younger, I was a go-getter, I was proactive, I was like, let's do this, right? Now that I'm older, I saw myself in a lot of instances as you were going through the presentation. I had to stop and I stop and think twice. I have to like, wait a minute, am I doing the right thing? And so my question is, I remember younger being proactive, being a go-getter, and now it's like, oh, wait a minute, maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should just think about this a little bit more.
Yeah.
Does that have to do with the progression of age in a person? Does it have to do with the person's personal experience? What do you?
Definitely. I mean, as we get older, we do have more baggage. I mean, let's be real. We've been through experiences. Some of them are positive and some of them are negative. And I think our life experiences shape how we think and shape how we feel. You know, there's a little innocence with younger population. There's an innocence, right? They don't have that life experience. They don't necessarily focus on the fears because they haven't experienced that yet, right? And I think as we get older, we become more knowledgeable. Some of us have had scars or experiences that burned us. And I think that's the voice, the little devil on our shoulder that's saying, be careful, right? And I think that's the lesson here is it's okay to feel that fear, but we don't want that fear to dictate our decisions. We want to use our gut instincts, right? And fear can cloud our gut instincts. Fear can pull us away from what we really want in life, right? And so, I hope that answers your question, but I think you kind of answered it yourself. It really does go back to how we were, our life experiences. And when it comes to your son, for instance, if he looks at change negative, he's going to approach change as a negative experience. And somewhere along the lines, he needs to, and hopefully you can share some of this information with him.
Absolutely.
To challenge that thinking, right? Because not all change is bad. In fact, yeah, exactly. Oh, you're muted, Mariella.
Oh, sorry about that. So, Taryn, again, thank you so much for a very thought-provoking and relevant presentation. You touched on a lot of topics that are near and dear to our hearts, like, for instance, learning about the different thinking patterns and the ability to think outside the box,
right?
And pushing ourselves out of the comfort zone, which I think can be extremely scary. But in order to move forward, in order to grow, like you mentioned, I think it's a necessary evil sometimes. And again, thank you for answering my initial question, how to deal with the stress and anxiety and the different techniques that are available to us. So thank you so much for that.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
I do want to share my screen one more time with the audience. And if you have any questions, any comments, please feel free to get in touch with me. I can be reached here at the library. That is my email address. Again, thank you to Taryn Abrahams. You see her website and her email. Again, if you feel like reaching out to her, I'm sure she'll be more than happy to guide you and work with you. So again, feel free to reach out to either of us. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us here at the library and attend our career development series. Thank you all. I hope to see you again. Remember, this is a monthly program free of charge. So I look forward to seeing you in the future. Thanks again, everyone. Hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.